What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 8.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over every position and give you my 2019 fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 8. This should help you decide who you want to start in your season-long fantasy football leagues. And we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to make better fantasy football picks. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups to see who is projected to score the most fantasy points this week. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football lineups. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Okay guys, fantasy football week 8. Sit 'em, start 'em at the quarterback position. So I'm going to start Jared Goff from the LA Rams playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have the 6th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Jared Goff has averaged 16.3 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 25 fantasy points last week. He's projected at 20 fantasy points here in week 8, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points scored in this game, and they have the LA Rams favored by 12.5. So Vegas thinks the Rams are going to do most of the scoring. Jared Goff looked great last week. He's connecting with all his wide receivers. There's a high game total. This is a home game for Jared Goff. I think we see similar production as we did last week, so that makes him a great start here in week 8. So I like Jared Goff here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. I'm also going to start Gardner Minshew from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the New York Jets. This is a home game for Gardner Minshew. We just saw the New York Jets in the Monday night game, and their defense doesn't look that good. I know Gardner Minshew is no Tom Brady, but he's averaging 16.7 fantasy points per game on the season, and he scored 21 fantasy points last week. He's projected to score 17 fantasy points this week. I think he can do better than that, so I'm starting Gardner Minshew. Another guy that's scary to start, but he's been doing pretty well lately. I'm starting Andy Dalton from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the LA Rams, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Andy Dalton has averaged 16.9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 21 fantasy points last week. The one nice thing about starting Andy Dalton is this guy's always playing from behind, so the game is almost always a passing game script, giving him the opportunity to score fantasy points for all 4 quarters. He's projected at 15.7 fantasy points here in week 8, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points scored in this game, and they've got the Cincinnati Bengals trailing by 12.5. So I know this is scary, but I'm going to start Andy Dalton here versus the LA Rams. Okay, now let's take a look at some of the quarterbacks that I'm going to sit here in week 8. I'm going to sit Jimmy Garoppolo from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Carolina Panthers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 8th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Jimmy Garoppolo's been struggling. He only scored 7 fantasy points last week. A big part of that was due to the weather. It was rainy. The weather was a mess. So we can give him a pass on that game. But look at his other games. 13 fantasy points, 15 fantasy points. He's only averaging 13.6 fantasy points per game on the season, and Vegas only thinks there's going to be 41.5 points scored in this game. They've got the 49ers favored by 5, but I haven't seen enough out of Jimmy Garoppolo yet, so I'm going to sit Jimmy Garoppolo here versus the Carolina Panthers. Another guy I'm going to sit, even though he's coming off of a pretty good game last week. He scored 23 fantasy points last week, but he's only averaging 13.1 fantasy points per game on the season. I'm going to sit Baker Mayfield from the Cleveland Browns playing the New England Patriots, who have the absolute best defense overall and give up the fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. I'm not going to mess around with Baker Mayfield versus the Patriots. We see what they're doing week in and week out, shutting teams down. So I'm going to sit Baker Mayfield here versus the New England Patriots. I'm also going to sit Kyle Allen from the Carolina Panthers playing the San Francisco 49ers, who are the second best defense overall and give up the second fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Kyle Allen, he's coming off of a pretty good game. He scored 17 fantasy points last week, but he's only averaging 14.2 fantasy points per game on the season. I don't trust him versus this San Francisco defense, so I'm going to sit Kyle Allen here versus the San Francisco 49ers.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching. If you want to enter the drawing for $100 PayPal, all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won, and then we'll send you $100 PayPal. So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay guys, week 8 fantasy football starts and sits for the running back position. I'm going to start Todd Gurley from the LA Rams playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have the 6th worst defense overall and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Todd Gurley has averaged 13.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 12 fantasy points last game, but the good news is he got 18 rush attempts. That's above his season average of 13.7 rush attempts per game, so I like the uptick in rushes. He's projected at 12.4 fantasy points here in week 8. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points in this game. This is the game they have the Rams favored by 12.5. So that's a running game script for the Rams. If they can keep the lead, they should look to Todd Gurley to help shorten the game. It's a home game for Gurley. It seems like he's building momentum. So I'm going to start Todd Gurley here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Another guy I'm going to start, he didn't have the week a lot of people thought he would last week, but I'm going to start James White from the New England Patriots playing the Cleveland Browns, who have the 10th worst defense overall and give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. James White has averaged 9.9 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets an average of 7.8 pass targets, so he's more of a wide receiver. He gets 3.5 rushes per game, and he's projected right about 10 fantasy points here in week 8. That's not bad from your flex spot if you're looking for a player to start. He's got a great matchup. It's a home game for James White. They've been blowing people out. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47 points scored in this game, and they have the Patriots favored by 12.5. So there could be a lot of check down passes to James White to help run out the clock. So I'm starting James White here versus the Cleveland Browns. Another guy I'm going to start, despite the return of Melvin Gordon, is Austin Ekeler from the LA Chargers playing the Chicago Bears, who have the 6th best defense overall, but they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Austin Ekeler has averaged 19.4 fantasy points per game on the season. Now we know a lot of that was with Melvin Gordon out, but even with Melvin Gordon back, he's still a big part of this offense. He scored 22 fantasy points last week. He's averaging 7.6 targets per game and 9.9 rushes per game. So he's still getting plenty of work. Projected at 11.3 fantasy points here in week 8. The Chicago Bears have a good defense, but they've been giving it up to running backs. So I'm going to start Austin Ekeler here versus the Chicago Bears. Okay, let's take a look at a few players that I'm going to sit at the running back position. I'm going to sit Joe Mixon from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the LA Rams, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing running backs. Joe Mixon is only averaging 12 rushes per game on the season and 3 pass targets per game. His team is always playing from behind, so the game script is almost never in his favor. They've got Cincinnati Bengals trailing by 12.5, so it's going to be hard for Joe Mixon to get involved in this offense. So I'm going to sit Joe Mixon here versus the LA Rams. Another guy I'm going to sit is Matt Breida from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Carolina Panthers. Breida is averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season off of 12.2 rush attempts per game. But we've seen those numbers come down over the last couple of weeks, and he went out with an injury last week. So even if he plays, I don't want to risk it. I'm going to find another running back to start in his place. So I'm going to sit Matt Breida here versus the Carolina Panthers. And just because he burned everyone this week, I'm going to sit David Johnson from the Arizona Cardinals playing the New Orleans Saints, who have the 10th best defense overall and give up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. Now, we'll have to monitor this guy's status throughout the week, but he was active this Sunday and he didn't play. So that threw everyone for a loop. He was given the green light and then they didn't put him in the game. That's not supposed to happen. If he's not going to play, they normally rule the player out. But they ruled him as active as if he was going to play, and he didn't. So this guy's been frustrating. When he plays, he's out there producing, but now we've added some extra risk because of the success his backup has had. They might opt to give David Johnson a little more time to recover from those injuries because of the exceptional play of backup Chase Edmonds. If David Johnson plays and is a full go, it's going to be hard to sit him. But just watch the news on this player, and if he's questionable going into week 8, I think I'm going to avoid the risk and sit David Johnson here versus the New Orleans Saints.
Okay guys, if you're getting any value from this video, please hit that red subscribe button. We put out new fantasy football videos every day. So if you hit that subscribe button and ring that bell notification, you won't miss out on any of our new fantasy football videos. Tons of free stuff coming your way. It only takes a second, and it helps us push out more fantasy football content for you guys to consume each and every day. It's because of you subscribers that make this possible. So thank you for supporting this channel. Week 8, fantasy football, start 'em, sit 'em, wide receiver position. I'm going to start DK Metcalf from the Seattle Seahawks playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 2nd worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. DK Metcalf is averaging 8.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting 5.7 targets per game, and he got 9 pass targets last game. He's projected at 8.7 fantasy points here in week 8. And the reason I'm going to start this player is because he's got a great matchup, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 53.5 points scored in this game, and they've got the Seattle Seahawks favored by 5.5. So I think DK Metcalf can get a big piece of that scoring. So I'm starting DK Metcalf here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Another guy I'm going to start this week is Marvin Jones from the Detroit Lions playing the New York Giants, who have the 8th worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Marvin Jones is averaging 14 fantasy points per game on the season. A lot of that came from last week when he exploded for 38 fantasy points and 4 touchdowns. He averages 7 targets per game on the season, so he wasn't a one-hit wonder that game. This guy's been out there for 88% of the snaps. He's projected at 9.4 fantasy points here in week 8. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50 points scored in this game, and they have the Detroit Lions ahead by 6.5. This is a home game. I think he continues the momentum from last week, so I'm starting Marvin Jones here versus the New York Giants. And on the other side of the ball, in this high-scoring game, I'm going to start Golden Tate from the New York Giants playing the Detroit Lions, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 13th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers.
Golden Tate is averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 11 fantasy points last week off of 11 pass targets. He's averaging 8.7 pass targets per game on the season. He's on the field for 100% of the snaps, so he's always out there. He's projected at 11.4 fantasy points here in Week 8. So I'm going to start Golden Tate here versus the Detroit Lions. I'm also going to start Phillip Dorsett. He's back from injury from the New England Patriots playing the Cleveland Browns, who have the 10th worst defense overall and they're middle of the pack defending opposing wide receivers. Phillip Dorsett is averaging 9.9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 12 fantasy points in his return last week, averaging 4.5 pass targets per game, but he's making the most of them. He's projected at 8.8 fantasy points here in Week 8. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47 points scored in this game, and they have the Patriots favored by 12.5. Now, this would be a flex start. It's a home game for Phillip Dorsett. He's recovered from his injuries. He'll only be more healthy come the start of this game. He's definitely one of Tom Brady's favorite receivers. So if you need to fill a spot this week, I'm going to start Phillip Dorsett here versus the Cleveland Browns. And the guys that I'm looking to sit at the wide receiver position, I'm going to sit Robbie Anderson from the New York Jets playing the Jacksonville Jaguars. Sam Darnold looked awful last week. Robbie Anderson has big play potential, but he's just too risky to play in a season-long fantasy football team. There's other options that carry much less risk from a team that's got an offense that's clicking. So I'm going to sit Robbie Anderson here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. I'm also going to sit Nelson Agholor from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Buffalo Bills, who have the third best defense overall, and they give up the second fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Nelson Agholor had his time to shine while Alshon Jeffrey was sidelined. But since Jeffrey came back, Nelson Agholor hasn't done much. Only 3, 6, and 3 fantasy points in the last 3 games. This guy's too risky for me. He's in a bad matchup. So I'm going to sit Nelson Agholor here versus the Buffalo Bills. Another guy I'm going to sit, I had high hopes for this guy in Week 7. He just didn't work out. I'm going to sit Dante Pettis from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Carolina Panthers. I know, it was the weather game. I don't want to put it all on Dante Pettis, but he's only averaging 3.2 fantasy points per game on the season. He's only getting 2.8 pass targets per game, only on the field for 53% of the snaps. I think there's other guys you can play in your flex spot, so I'm going to sit Dante Pettis here versus the Carolina Panthers.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups. Okay, fantasy football, Week 8. Sit 'em, start 'em, tight end position. Okay, of course you're going to start guys like Darren Waller, Hunter Henry, Austin Hooper, but a guy you might not think of starting, I'm going to start Darren Fells from the Houston Texans playing the Oakland Raiders, who have the 3rd worst defense overall and give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Darren Fells is averaging 6.4 fantasy points per game on the season off of 3.1 pass targets per game. So those aren't amazing numbers, but he's on the field for almost 70% of the snaps. He's projected at 5.7 fantasy points here in Week 8, and I like this game total. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, with the Houston Texans favored by 6.5.
This is a home game for Darren Fells. This guy's been catching touchdowns. He didn't get one last week, but they're looking for him. So I'm going to start Darren Fells here versus the Oakland Raiders. Another guy I'm going to start, this is a clear start now. I'm going to start Gerald Everett from the LA Rams playing the Cincinnati Bengals. Jared Everett is getting a ton of targets. You got to start this guy on volume alone. The matchup doesn't matter so much. He got 10 pass targets last game, 5 the game before that, and 11 the game before that. So 26 pass targets over the last 3 weeks. Doesn't look like that's going to let up anytime soon. He's projected at 7.1 fantasy points here in week 8. So I'm going to start Gerald Everett here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Okay, so let's take a look at a tight end that I'm going to sit here in week 8. I'm going to sit Ricky Seals-Jones from the Cleveland Browns playing the New England Patriots. They've got the best defense in the league, guys. They're shutting teams down. Ricky Seals-Jones has had a couple of good games in the past 3 weeks, but one of those games is a 0, and he's only averaging 2.4 pass targets per game on the season. So in a bad matchup versus the New England Patriots, a player that's only on the field for 28% of the snaps, I'm going to sit Ricky Seals-Jones here versus the New England Patriots. Oh, and one more tight end that I'm going to start is TJ Hawkinson from the Detroit Lions playing the New York Giants.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite
player for this NFL slate.
I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.
Do you want more fantasy football picks? Check out the video linked right in the middle of the screen. If you got any value from this video, please tap that subscribe button before you get out of here and ring that bell notification so you won't miss our daily fantasy football uploads. We're putting out new videos every day, so I don't want you guys to miss any of our free content.